They thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow moving in the hallway. But when their child woke up one night, whispering about the big dog watching over them, the family realized something was there. And when they finally discovered the truth, it changed everything. Imagine waking up in the middle of the night, feeling a presence watching you, but instead of fear, you feel safe. That's exactly what happened to the Miller family. For years, they noticed strange things happening in their home. A warm breath in an empty room, the faint sound of paws padding across the floor. They thought they were imagining it, until the night they saw it with their own eyes. Was it a spirit, a protector, or something else entirely? This is the unbelievable true story of a dog's love that refused to die. The Millers had always dreamed of living in a quiet, peaceful home, somewhere they could raise their son without the constant noise and chaos of city life. So, when they found the charming old house on the outskirts of town, it felt like fate. It had everything they wanted: a big backyard, a wraparound porch, and enough space for their little boy, Noah, to grow up playing in the open air. Sarah and Mark Miller, both in their early 30s, were thrilled to finally settle down after years of moving from one rental to another. They envisioned weekend barbecues, chilly autumn nights by the fireplace, and warm summer evenings watching Noah chase fireflies. It was perfect, but from the very first night, something felt off. It wasn't something they could explain, just a feeling, a slight unease, like the house was holding its breath, waiting. Sarah, always practical, dismissed it. It was just the nervous excitement of moving into a new place. But Mark, though he didn't say anything at first, felt it too. And then there was Noah. Their 3-year-old son was normally fearless, the kind of kid who would run into a dark room without a second thought. But here, he acted differently. The first night, as Sarah tucked him into bed, he stared at the open doorway with wide eyes. His tiny fingers curled around his blanket, and then, in a small, matter-of-fact voice, he said, "Doggy." Sarah blinked. "What, sweetheart?" Noah pointed, right at the darkened doorway. "Doggy," he repeated, softer this time. Sarah glanced at the hallway. It was empty. A chill ran down her spine, but she forced a smile. "There's no doggy, honey." Noah frowned, confused. Then, as if deciding not to argue, he yawned and snuggled under the covers. Sarah kissed his forehead, whispered a good night, and turned off the light. She didn't think much of it. Kids had wild imaginations, after all. But the next night, he said it again, and the next, and the next. Every single night, Noah would point at the doorway and whisper, "Doggy," but they didn't have a dog. At first, Sarah and Mark laughed it off. "Maybe he just wants a pet," Mark suggested one evening as they unpacked boxes in the living room. "We did talk about getting a dog." Sarah nodded, though something about Noah's certainty bothered her. It wasn't the way a child might pretend to see something. It was the way he spoke, as if he truly believed it was real. Still, they let it go. Kids had imaginary friends all the time, right? But then the noises started. It began subtly. A faint scratching sound in the middle of the night. The kind of sound that you might hear if a dog was pawing at a door. Sarah heard it first. She woke up in the darkness, her heart pounding, and lay still, listening. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It was coming from the hallway. She held her breath, waiting. Then nothing. Silence. The next morning, she mentioned it to Mark, but he shrugged. Probably just the house settling. And that made sense. Old houses creaked. So, she brushed it off, until the next night, and the night after that. The scratching kept happening, sometimes soft, sometimes insistent, but always at night, and always outside Noah's room. Then came the claws. One evening, after putting Noah to bed, Sarah and Mark sat on the couch, watching TV. The house was quiet except for the muffled sound of dialogue from the screen. And then click, a soft, rhythmic tapping against the hardwood floor. Click, 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 like the sound of a dog walking. Mark muted the TV. "Did you hear that?" Sarah nodded slowly. Click, click, click. The sound moved from the hallway to the living room. Mark sat up, straining to listen. The sound was so familiar, so distinct. A dog's nails on wood. But when he turned on the lights, there was nothing there. They checked every room, every corner. Nothing. Mark exhaled sharply, rubbing his face. "I swear I heard it." Sarah's stomach twisted. "Me too." They both stared at each other, unsure of what to say. Eventually, they laughed it off, but it wasn't a real laugh. Neither of them slept well that night. And then came the paw prints. Sarah discovered them the following morning. She had just finished sweeping the hallway when she noticed something strange. A set of muddy paw prints, leading from the front door, all the way to Noah's room. Her breath caught in her throat. Noah was still asleep, his tiny form curled under the blankets, completely undisturbed. She stepped back, her mind racing. Had Mark walked through the house with dirty shoes? Had Noah been playing outside? But the prints were too big for a child, and too perfectly shaped. Sarah cleaned them without saying anything. She didn't want to sound crazy. But then, the next morning they were back. Same spot, same path leading to Noah's room. She felt a cold sweat break across her skin. This wasn't normal. So, that night, she made sure to lock every door and window before bed. The house was sealed. No way in. But the next morning, fresh paw prints. Mark saw them too this time. His face paled. What the hell is going on? Sarah swallowed hard. I don't know. And then Noah spoke, standing barefoot in the hallway, rubbing his sleepy eyes. He pointed at the prints and smiled. Doggy. Sarah felt her stomach drop. Mark crouched beside him, his voice careful. Noah, buddy, where do you see the doggy? Noah looked at them like they were the silly ones. Then, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world, he said, right there, and pointed at empty air. At first, the signs were subtle, easy to dismiss. A creak in the hallway, when no one was there. The faint rustling of something moving in the shadows. The sensation of being watched. Sarah Miller, a logical woman by nature, kept telling herself it was all in her head, that she was just stressed from the move or overtired from taking care of Noah. But the night on the couch changed everything. She was sitting alone in the living room, scrolling through her phone, when she felt it. A sudden warmth pressed against her leg. It wasn't just the heat, it was the pressure, the distinct weight of something leaning against her, like a dog. Her breath caught in her throat. Without thinking, she reached down, expecting to feel fur, expecting to touch something, but her hand met nothing but air. She jerked her leg away, her heart pounding. The warmth vanished instantly. Sarah sat there, staring at the empty space beside her, her pulse racing. She wanted to call out to Mark, but what would she even say? That she thought an invisible dog had just curled up beside her? That sounded ridiculous. So she laughed, a forced, nervous laugh. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just her imagination. And Mark, he was already starting to suspect something too. The first time it happened was almost easy to ignore. Almost. It was around 2 a.m. Sarah and Mark were asleep when a sudden low growl echoed through the house. It wasn't loud, but it was deep, guttural. The kind of growl that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. Sarah shot up in bed, her heart hammering in her chest. Mark stirred beside her, groggy. Did you hear that? Sarah didn't answer. She was too busy listening. The house was silent again. Maybe it was a dream. But then the smell hit them. Something was burning. Sarah bolted out of bed. She rushed to the kitchen, and there it was. The toaster, still plugged in, was sparking. The smell of burnt plastic filled the air. Her hands trembled as she unplugged it. A moment later, the spark stopped. Mark came in behind her, rubbing his eyes. What the hell? Sarah swallowed hard. If she hadn't woken up, if they hadn't caught it in time, the thought made her stomach turn. But what had woken her? The growl, the phantom bark. She didn't want to say it out loud, but the truth was there, lingering unspoken between them. Something, or someone, was watching over them. But that was only the first time. The second time, it saved Noah's life. A few nights later, Sarah woke to the sound of movement, a soft patter of tiny feet moving across the hallway. At first, she thought she was dreaming. Then a bark, sharp, urgent. Sarah snapped awake. Noah. She threw off the blankets and ran. Mark was right behind her as they rushed out into the hallway, just in time to see Noah at the top of the staircase. He was half asleep, his little body swaying as he rubbed his eyes. One more step, and he would have tumbled down the stairs. Sarah's heart stopped. But then Noah froze. His tiny hands clenched into fists. His sleepy eyes widened. Then he did something strange. He reached out, as if touching something invisible in front of him. Then he whispered, "Doggy." Sarah grabbed him before he could fall, pulling him close, her entire body shaking. Mark ran his hands over his face, trying to steady his breathing. They both knew. They both felt it. Noah hadn't stopped on his own. Someone had stopped him. Sarah didn't sleep that night. Neither did Mark. They sat awake in bed, listening to the quiet creaks of the house, listening to the phantom click-click-click of claws on the wooden floor. The moment that changed everything happened exactly 1 week later. Sarah had been sleeping restlessly. Every little sound made her jolt awake. So when she woke up in the middle of the night, she wasn't sure why at first. Then she heard it, a soft whimper. It came from Noah's room. Her heart squeezed. She got up quickly, not bothering to wake Mark, and padded down the hallway. The closer she got, the stronger the feeling in her chest grew. That feeling of being watched. She opened the door. and froze. Noel was fast asleep in bed, but at the foot of his bed, a dog, a massive German shepherd, sitting silently, staring at her. Her breath caught in her throat. It was real. It was right there. Every instinct screamed at her to move, to run, to do something, but the dog just stared. Its deep brown eyes were calm, warm, familiar. Then it blinked, and just like that, it was gone, vanished, like it had never been there. Sarah stood there, shaking, barely able to breathe. She wasn't crazy. She had seen it, and she knew it had been real. But how? Why? She stumbled back into the bedroom, waking Mark. "I saw it," she whispered. His eyes snapped open. "What? The dog?" she said, voice trembling. "I saw it." And for the first time, Mark didn't try to rationalize, because deep down, he had already known. They both knew something was in their house, and whatever it was watching over them. Sarah had never been one to believe in ghosts. Sure, she had heard stories, old tales whispered by people who swore they had seen something beyond this world, but she never imagined she would be one of them. Yet here she was. She had seen the dog, felt its presence, heard its warnings, and now she needed to understand. She couldn't just let it go, not after everything. There was something about that dog, something more than just a shadow or an echo of the past. So she started digging. At first, it was simple curiosity, a way to rationalize what had happened. But the deeper she searched, the more unsettled she became, because the truth broke her heart. It started with a conversation. Sarah went to visit Mrs. Langley, an elderly woman who had lived on their street for decades. If anyone knew the history of the house, it would be her. Sarah hesitated before knocking on the door, her mind racing. How did she even begin to ask something like this? "Hey, did a ghost dog ever live in my house?" Ridiculous, but she needed to know. So when Mrs. Langley answered, Sarah forced a smile and chose her words carefully. "Hi, Mrs. Langley. I was wondering if you knew anything about the family that lived in our house before us." Mrs. Langley gave a knowing smile. "Oh dear, you mean the Shelbys? Lovely couple. They lived there for years." Sarah leaned in. "Do you remember if they had a dog?" Mrs. Langley's smile faded. For a moment, she just stared, as if debating whether to answer. Then she sighed. "Oh, yes, Mac." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. He was a beautiful German shepherd, so loyal, never left their side. He was more than just a pet. He was family. The way she said it made Sarah's throat tighten. She already knew where this was going, but she had to hear it. What happened to him? Mrs. Langley exhaled slowly, as if the memory itself was too heavy to carry. When Mr. Shelby passed away, his wife was forced to leave. She had no choice but to move into a retirement home. They wouldn't allow pets. Sarah swallowed hard. "And Max?" Mrs. Langley's eyes glistened with something deeply painful. "He waited." Sarah's breath hitched. "What do you mean?" "He refused to leave," Mrs. Langley said softly. After Mrs. Shelby moved, Max stayed behind. He sat at the front door, waiting for his owner to come home. Day after day, rain or shine, Sarah could barely breathe. Mrs. Langley's voice cracked, but she never came back. A lump formed in Sarah's throat. Max had waited and waited, but the door never opened. His owner never returned. The realization sent a wave of overwhelming sadness crashing over her, because she knew what came next. "What happened to him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Langley wiped at her eyes. "He passed away, right there, by the front door." Sarah closed her eyes, fighting back tears. The ghostly paw prints, the clicking of claws on the floor, the presence that had been watching over them. It all made sense now. Max never left. Sarah felt a deep, aching sadness as she walked home. But there was something else, too. Gratitude. Max wasn't just some restless spirit. He had been protecting them, guarding their home, just like he had once guarded his owners. And now he had been guarding her family. The growl that saved them from a fire, the bark that stopped Noah from falling, the presence that curled up beside her on the couch, as if still offering comfort. Max had never stopped being a protector, even in death. Sarah walked into the house with new eyes. She saw the space near the front door where Max must have waited, day after day, for someone who never came back. She imagined him, curled up there, watching, hoping, waiting. She could almost hear the faint sound of breathing. For the first time since all of this began, she didn't feel afraid. She felt honored. That night, as the house settled into silence, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The air felt different, not heavy like before, not cold or eerie, just calm. For weeks, they had lived with the unexplained, the sounds, the paw prints, the presence that lingered in every room. And though fear had gripped her at first, she had long since stopped being afraid, because she knew now, she understood, and she was grateful. Sarah moved quietly through the dim hallway, the wooden floors cool beneath her bare feet. She peeked into Noah's room, watching his small chest rise and fall with each peaceful breath. His tiny fingers curled around his favorite stuffed bear, oblivious to the strange, beautiful presence that had been watching over him all along. She walked closer, kneeling beside his bed. Her heart swelled with emotion. Noah would never know just how much Max had protected him, but Sarah knew. And so, with a lump in her throat, she leaned in and placed a gentle kiss on Noah's forehead. Then, with a quiet breath, she whispered, "Thank you, Max." The words felt strange, but right. They carried weight, as if they had been waiting to be spoken. For a long moment, the house held its breath. And then something changed. Sarah didn't know why, but she suddenly felt lighter, as if the air around her had shifted, as if something unseen had been waiting for those words, and now it could rest. She didn't understand how she knew. She just did. Sarah stood up, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. She walked back to her bedroom, but she couldn't sleep. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts of Max, his story, his loyalty, his quiet, unshakable love. And then, she felt it, a sudden stillness in the air, not the eerie, unexplainable stillness that had once made her uneasy. This was different, peaceful. Sarah sat up, her pulse quickening, and then she saw it, a shadow, large, familiar, standing at the foot of Noah's bed. For a split second, her breath caught in her throat. Max. But this time, something was different. He wasn't watching them with sad, longing eyes. He wasn't standing guard, tense and alert. He looked content, peaceful, free. His ears were relaxed, his posture at ease. And then, he wagged his tail, once, slow, gentle, a silent farewell. Sarah blinked, her vision blurring with sudden tears. And just like that, he was gone, this time for good. But there was no fear, no sadness, only gratitude. Sarah closed her eyes, a soft smile forming on her lips. Max had waited, not just for his owner, but for this moment, for the reassurance that his job was done, that the family he had protected, his family, was safe. And now, finally, he could rest. Sarah lay back down, a single tear slipping down her cheek. She whispered one last time, "Goodbye, Max." And for the first time in weeks, she slept. The next morning, the sun streamed through the curtains, casting warm golden light across the wooden floors. Sarah stirred, slowly waking from the most peaceful sleep she had had in weeks. For the first time in a long time, there was no strange feeling in the air, no cold spots, no distant echoing sounds, just normalcy. She sat up, running a hand through her hair. The house felt different, lighter, like the weight of something unseen had finally lifted. And deep down she knew, Max was gone, not because he had been forced to leave, but because he had chosen to, because he knew they were safe now. Sarah got out of bed and walked downstairs. Noah was already up, playing in the living room. His tiny fingers pushed his toy trucks across the carpet, his face full of innocent joy. And for the first time in weeks, there were no paw prints. Sarah's breath hitched. No muddy tracks leading to Noah's room. No unexplained marks on the floor. Just stillness. Not emptiness. Not sadness. Just peace. She knelt down beside Noah, brushing a gentle hand through his messy hair. "Did you sleep well, buddy?" Noah nodded, his eyes still focused on his toys. Then, out of nowhere, he smiled and said, "Doggy gone now." Sarah froze. Her throat tightened. She stared at Noah, her pulse quickening. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it. But then, he looked up at her with bright, knowing eyes. "Doggy is happy." Sarah swallowed hard, her vision blurring. Noah hadn't been afraid of Max. He had seen him all along. And now, just like Sarah, he knew Max was at peace. Sarah took a shaky breath and kissed the top of Noah's head. She didn't need to explain. Noah already understood. She stood up and walked toward the front door, drawn to it as if something unseen was calling her. Slowly, she reached out and placed a hand against the wood. For weeks, Max had waited here, day after day, rain or shine. His loyalty had never wavered, not in life, not in death. And even though he was gone, Sarah knew his love had never left. She closed her eyes, feeling a warmth spread through her chest, because even though Max had moved on, his presence would always be a part of this home. Not in the form of eerie sounds or shadowy figures, not in ghostly paw prints or mysterious warnings, but in the love and protection he had left behind. a legacy of loyalty, a love that defied even death. Sarah smiled through her tears. She whispered, just loud enough for the universe to hear, "Thank you, Max." And for the first time in a long time, she let go. Not of the love, not of the gratitude, but of the weight, because Max had moved on, and now so could they. A loyal dog never truly leaves the ones he loves, and Max's love, it would always remain. If this story gave you chills, hit subscribe for more unbelievable animal stories.